In the trenches, the line between life and death had vanished. Shells tore through the sky, crashing down as explosions sent earth and bodies flying. Soldiers struggled to advance, stepping over corpses sunk into the mud, while the wounded thrashed desperately in the swamp-like ground to avoid drowning. Machine guns spewed death without pause, and those struck fell one by one. As the air filled with the stench of smoke and blood, the survivors knew that death waited just a few steps away. By 1916, the Western Front was completely deadlocked. Neither Germany nor the Allies had achieved a decisive victory. The front line was trapped between trenches, stretching across France and Belgium. The Germans suffered heavy losses while attempting to wear down the French in the Battle of Verdun. In response, British and French commanders devised an offensive to relieve the pressure on Verdun by putting new strain on the Germans. The area around the Somme River was chosen as the site of the attack. Initially, the offensive was meant to be led by the French, but due to their losses at Verdun, the British took over responsibility. General Douglas Haig saw this assault not just as a supporting operation, but as a major offensive that could break the German lines and turn the war in their favor. The Somme region was vast but well suited for defense. The Germans had established a strong defensive line with reinforced concrete bunkers and machine gun nests. The British planned to destroy these positions with a massive artillery bombardment. However, how well this plan aligned with the realities of war remained a major question. British and French troops underwent weeks of preparation before the attack. Ammunition stockpiles were increased, fresh soldiers were moved to the front, and artillery was positioned for a bombardment expected to cause massive destruction. Commanders believed this heavy artillery fire would almost completely obliterate the German lines. Soldiers were told they would face only light resistance and could easily break through enemy positions. However, no one truly knew what awaited them. Haig ordered one of the largest artillery bombardments in history to crush the enemy positions. Beginning on June 24, 1916, and lasting 7 days, a staggering 1.7 million shells rained down on the German lines. The ground shook, and thick black smoke rose from the trenches. British soldiers prepared for the assault, believing they would find a barren wasteland left in the wake of the explosions. However, the Germans had not been destroyed as expected. Sheltered within their reinforced bunkers and deep trenches, they had survived the onslaught and were waiting, ready for the impending attack. At 7:30 in the morning, the whistles blew. British and French soldiers emerged and began advancing forward. Believing the artillery barrage had completely crushed the Germans, the generals had ordered the troops to move calmly and in formation. However, this proved to be a terrible mistake. As German machine gun nests began to unleash death, British lines were mowed down like harvested crops. The barbed wire, largely untouched by the bombardment, trapped soldiers who fell one by one within its tangled mass. Amidst the screams, the hail of bullets, and the explosions, hundreds of soldiers collapsed to the ground, bloodied. The British suffered 57,000 casualties in a single day, marking the bloodiest day in their history. Those attempting to retreat to their trenches became targets for German snipers. The wounded writhed in pain in no man's land, which had turned into an unreachable death zone where no one could offer help. That day, it seemed as though the dead were buried in the ground before they even had a chance to move. Even when the British commanders realized that the anticipated breakthrough had not occurred, they did not halt the attack. New waves of soldiers were pushed forward again and again. However, each new assault ended the same way. Piles of human flesh lay sprawled over the barbed wire, their blood mixing with the mud. Especially the areas of Beaumont-Hamel and Thiepval hosted some of the most horrific scenes of the war. The Newfoundland Regiment, which fought here, suffered a 90% casualty rate and was almost completely wiped out. As soldiers emerged from their trenches, they were struck down by bullets, and those who survived were torn apart under the enemy's bombardment. As every inch of the land was soaked in blood, life for the survivors in the trenches became a torturous existence. Hunger, thirst, and the constant barrage of artillery created a psychological nightmare that pushed the soldiers to the brink of madness. Sleeping at night was impossible. They struggled to avoid drowning in the mud while trying to survive amidst rats and corpses. Throughout July, the British and French began to make small advances. A few villages, such as Mametz and Montauban, were captured, but these gains came at a horrific cost. Every inch of ground gained was bought with the lives of thousands of soldiers. The struggle for the village of Pozières, in particular, demonstrated how relentless the war had become. Australian forces, suffering 80% casualties, fought to the last drop of their blood. The land was no longer slipping through their fingers in mud, but in blood. The screams rising amid the sound of gunfire were the most striking evidence of the wounds the war had inflicted on both the human body and soul. On the other hand, the German soldiers were also being worn down. They dug trenches at night to maintain their defenses and put up a bloody resistance with machine guns during the day. For them, the Somme had become a death trap as well. By the end of July, progress had slowed considerably, and the soldiers were trapped in a hellish quagmire. The August rains turned the trenches into cemeteries. The mud swallowed the bodies, and the wounded were buried in this mire. Every step had become a death march, sinking further into the morass. Despite the minimal gains, the British and French commanders were determined to continue the assault. However, for the soldiers, the war had now become a battle, not only against the enemy, but also against nature itself. Their weapons were buried up to the hilt in mud, ammunition was running low, and the outcome of the war had become uncertain. There was something odd about the German trenches. The ground was gently shaking, small stones and dust were falling. The soldiers thought it was approaching artillery fire, but there was no sound of explosions. The tremor coming from underground continued unusually. Then, a deep and continuous hum began. At first, it sounded like the distant rattle of a machine gun, then grew into a heavier metallic rumble. The soldiers in the trenches didn't know what was approaching, but an eerie sense of unease grew within them. No one could see anything, only feel its presence. And then, that unknown thing passed by. All that remained were deep tracks of tank treads in the mud.